In most Viking households, birth followed a familiar rhythm. A cry, a pause, a nod from the midwife, and then life settled quickly into order. Noise was expected, but only briefly. Strength was admired, but it was supposed to be patient strength. Even chaos, in its own way, had rules. This child did not seem interested in rules. From the moment he arrived, he filled the longhouse with sound, not the fragile cry of a newborn finding air, but something closer to a declaration. Sharp, relentless, the kind of noise that makes people glance at one another and silently agree not to comment. At least, not yet. The midwife tried the usual reassurances. Some babies cry more than others, some arrive louder, some simply need time. She had said this before. She had said it many times. Still, she said it again because tradition demanded calm explanations, even when calm felt like an optimistic theory. But the sound did not fade. Days passed and the volume remained. Nights did not soften it. Hunger made it worse. Cold made it louder. Even warmth failed to quiet it for long. When other infants learned to rest in steady rhythms, this one seemed alert, restless, reactive, as if the world had already offended him and he intended to file a complaint. In a Viking community, discipline was not optional, it was survival. Order kept ships afloat, shields aligned, and winters endured. Children were taught early to observe, to wait, to follow instruction. Strength without control was not admired. It was corrected. This child resisted correction. He startled easily. A dropped tool, a raised voice, a sudden movement, each produced an immediate reaction. Limbs stiffened, breathing sharpened. The body responded as if permanently braced for impact. No one said the word anger out loud, but the idea hovered nearby, uncomfortable and uninvited. The elders noticed. They did not gather dramatically or announce conclusions. Vikings rarely did. Instead, comments slipped into conversation like splinters. He is spirited. He does not rest easily. He watches too closely. Each phrase sounded harmless on its own. Together, they formed something closer to concern. There was an unspoken understanding in the settlement. Some people were born for steady roles, farmers, traders, craftsmen. Others drifted naturally toward leadership, toward navigation, toward the patient mathematics of sail and tide. And then very rarely, there were those who did not settle anywhere at all. This child showed no interest in settling. As he grew, the volume softened, but the intensity remained. He did not observe the world so much as challenge it. Where other children hesitated, he pushed forward. Where others learned when to stop, he seemed to test how far stopping could be delayed. Authority did not frighten him. It irritated him. This was not celebrated. Despite modern imagination, Viking society was not a festival of chaos. It valued restraint. A warrior who lost control endangered everyone around him. A sailor who acted on impulse drowned others along with himself. Rage was not heroic. It was inefficient. And yet here was a child whose body seemed designed for reaction rather than reflection. Adults tried structure, tasks, routine, predictable days. The results were mixed at best. The structure held, but only under pressure, like a bent shield that snapped back the moment a hand was removed. The calm was temporary. The tension underneath remained. Somewhere between observation and resignation, an idea began to form, quietly, reluctantly. Perhaps this one was not meant to fit. Not everyone was born to harmonize with the group. Some people arrived already misaligned, tuned to a different frequency. They did not blend into the rhythm of daily life. They disrupted it, not always intentionally, not always maliciously, simply by existing. No one said this aloud. Vikings preferred action to philosophy, but the idea settled anyway, like frost forming along the edges of thought. This child was not broken. That much was clear. He was strong, alert, unmistakably alive, but he was also inconvenient, uncomfortable, a presence that could not be ignored and could not be smoothed away. In a world built on discipline, he was noise. And sometimes noise does not disappear. Sometimes it finds a purpose, later one no one planned for. But for now, in these early years, there was only the sound, the tension, the sense that something had arrived slightly out of alignment with everything around it, and the quiet, uneasy realization that not all people are born to belong. Some are born to test the limits of belonging itself. The untrainable child. By early childhood, the problem could no longer be described as temporary. Some children stumble, some break things, some test limits simply to discover where those limits live. This child did all of that and then continued, as if limits were suggestions rather than instructions. The damage was rarely intentional. That was the most confusing part. Objects simply did not survive his presence for long. A wooden bucket cracked after being carried with enthusiasm rather than care. A door hinge loosened under repeated slamming, not out of anger, but momentum. A fence rail leaned slightly forever, bent during a game that had started as play and ended as renovation. No one accused him of cruelty. That would have required planning. What he possessed instead was an endless surplus of energy, poorly distributed and aggressively curious. He moved through space as though everything around him was part of an experiment he had not designed but felt obligated to complete. Patience did not come naturally. When asked to wait, he waited briefly, then acted. When told to watch, he watched only long enough to confirm that action would be more interesting. Instructions reached him, paused momentarily, and then drifted away, displaced by motion. The village tried teaching him the usual way. He was given tasks meant to build discipline. Carry this, stack that, sit here, listen. The results were inconsistent. He completed tasks quickly, often too quickly, skipping steps not out of rebellion, but because his mind had already moved ahead. This was not defiance. Defiance implies resistance. This was acceleration. He did not push against rules, he outran them. Adults began to notice a pattern. When left alone, he caused fewer problems. When closely supervised, the situation deteriorated. Correction did not calm him, it sharpened him. Raised voices made him more alert. Strict routines made him restless. The very tools designed to produce order seemed to energize him further. It was deeply inconvenient. Viking society, despite its reputation, preferred predictability. Communities survived through cooperation, not constant correction. And yet here was a child who required constant attention while simultaneously responding poorly to it. The neighbors adjusted. At first they worried, then they complained. Eventually they sighed. This was the natural progression. He means no harm. someone would say, usually while surveying a minor disaster. A spilled grain sack, a broken handle, a tool dropped into water. The tone carried less anger and more resignation. It was the sound of expectations being quietly lowered. Children stopped being assigned to watch him. Tools were stored higher. Fragile objects learned to relocate themselves when he entered a space. This was not avoidance, it was adaptation. The village was learning. He did not respond well to being told what not to do, but when given something to move, something to lift, something to chase, he focused briefly, intensely, with almost impressive dedication. His attention came in bursts, short, powerful, exhausting, and then it vanished. Someone eventually noticed that accidents decreased when he was given a direction rather than a restriction. Not rules, vectors. Go there. Carry this. Run until you're tired. The instructions were simple, physical, direct. They matched the way his mind already moved through the world. This was not education in the traditional sense. There were no lessons about patience or restraint. Those concepts seemed abstract, theoretical, perhaps meant for other people. He learned through collision instead, trial, error, and immediate consequence. The community began to adjust its thinking. Perhaps the mistake was assuming he needed to be fixed. Perhaps control was the wrong goal entirely. There was a quiet shift in language. He is difficult became he is different. Unmanageable softened into unplaceable. The change was subtle but meaningful. It marked the moment when expectation transformed into strategy. Not everyone fits into existing structures. Some people require new ones or none at all. This realization did not arrive dramatically. There was no meeting, no announcement, just a growing sense that the effort to reshape him was costing more than the effort to redirect him. So the village did what it always did best. It adapted. Tasks became physical. Time outdoors increased. Responsibility was introduced carefully, like a tool handed over without instruction, just observation. Mistakes were allowed. Repairs became routine. Interestingly, he learned quickly when consequences were immediate and tangible. A dropped object broke. A rushed movement caused pain not severe, just instructive. The world corrected him more effectively than people ever had. There was mild irony in this. A society built on discipline had produced someone who could only learn through disorder. But the irony was not lost on them for long. Eventually, the worry faded into something resembling acceptance. Not approval, not pride, just understanding. He was not going to become calm. He was not going to become quiet. He was not going to become easy. And that was fine. Every community has a role for energy. Even excessive energy, especially excessive energy. It simply needs somewhere to go. The child remained loud, restless, difficult to contain, but he was no longer a problem to be solved. He was a force to be aimed. And for the first time, the village stopped asking how to control him and began wondering where he might be useful. Becoming a project. At some point, the village stopped asking the wrong question. For years, the conversation had circled around what was wrong with the boy. Why he moved too fast. Why he reacted too strongly. Why calm instructions seemed to slide off him without leaving a mark. But eventually, exhaustion did what philosophy could not. It shifted the focus. The question quietly changed from, "What is wrong with him?" to, Where can we put him so he stops breaking things? This was not cruelty, it was practicality. Viking communities survived by solving problems efficiently, and the boy had become a recurring problem predictable in his unpredictability. Tools broke, routines bent, patience thinned, not out of malice, but out of sheer presence. So, like a cracked beam in a longhouse, he was no longer ignored or repaired. He was reinforced, redirected, reassigned. Someone no one remembers who suggested giving him work that could withstand force, something loud, something physical, something that would not shatter when enthusiasm arrived unannounced. This marked the beginning of his transformation. Not into a hero, not into a warrior, but into a project. The word itself was never spoken aloud, of course. Vikings did not label people so formally, but the behavior changed. He was no longer corrected as often. Instructions became fewer and simpler. Expectations were lowered, then rearranged. "Let him push," someone said. "Let him shout," another added. "Just don't let him near the fragile things." And so he was introduced to labor that welcomed momentum. Chopping wood, dragging heavy objects, carrying loads that required strength rather than finesse. There was no ceremony, no rite of passage, just a quiet understanding that energy, when given nowhere to go, becomes a problem, but when aimed, becomes a resource. The training, if it could be called that, was informal to the point of chaos. No techniques were taught, no lessons about posture, balance, or restraint. There were no speeches about honor or discipline. Those concepts required reflection, and reflection was not his strength. Instead, there was repetition. Lift, push, run, shout, repeat. People spoke less to him and around him more. Demonstrations replaced explanations. Correction came not from voices, but from gravity, weight, and fatigue. Interestingly, he responded, not with obedience, with engagement. When given something heavy enough, his attention held. When tasks demanded full exertion, distractions faded. He did not become calm, but he became focused, briefly, intensely, as if his entire being had finally found a task large enough to occupy it. This was not control. It was containment. There was a strange irony in it all. Viking society valued discipline, yet the boy thrived only when discipline was loosened. The tighter the grip, the more he resisted. The moment expectations relaxed, he surged forward. He was not learning to obey, he was learning to release. The shouting began here, not as rage, but as output. Noise had always been part of him. Now, instead of being suppressed, it was allowed, encouraged even. A loud breath released tension. A shout accompanied effort. Silence, it turned out, had never been his natural state. The adults noticed something unsettling. When he shouted, he moved better. His strength seemed amplified by sound. Coordination improved, not refined, but committed. Movements became larger, less precise, but more effective in their own way. He did not calculate. He committed fully, every time, as if hesitation simply did not exist in his vocabulary. This was not technique. It was inertia. Once moving, he did not stop easily. Once engaged, he did not pause to reconsider. Momentum carried him forward long after caution would have intervened for someone else, and that, strangely enough, made him useful. The village did not celebrate this. There were no proud declarations about discovering a hidden talent. Instead, There was acceptance mixed with mild concern, the kind of concern reserved for tools that worked extremely well but could not be trusted unsupervised. "He needs space," someone said. "He needs distance," said another. "Keep him moving," became the unspoken rule. They began placing him on the edge of things, edge of the village, edge of tasks, edge of responsibility. Not central enough to disrupt daily life, but close enough to be deployed when needed. This was management, not mentorship. No one attempted to teach him restraint. That idea had been quietly abandoned. Instead, they managed the fallout. They planned around him. They anticipated excess and adjusted accordingly. And slowly, something resembling a role emerged. He was not expected to integrate. He was expected to expend. This distinction mattered. The stories that would later surround figures like him often speak of discipline, rituals, and structured transformation. But in reality, this phase was defined by its absence of control. He was shaped not by rules, but by the lack of them. The village did not mold him into something new. They stopped trying to mold him at all. In doing so, they allowed something already present to surface fully unchecked, unpolished, and undeniably powerful. The unsettling part was not his strength. It was how natural it all felt once control released. He did not become calmer, he became louder. He did not become safer, he became more effective, not because he learned discipline, but because he was finally allowed to move without constant resistance. And in a society that prized order, this was an uncomfortable truth. Some forces are not created through discipline. They emerge when discipline steps aside. By the end of this phase, the boy was no longer merely difficult. He was categorized, managed, directed, not trusted exactly but accounted for. He was no longer a question. He was an answer to a problem no one had wanted to ask. And though no one used the word yet, the shape of what he would become had begun to take form, not through control, but through the deliberate act of letting go. The Rite of the Bear. By the time the village decided he was ready, no one bothered to explain what ready meant. Explanation had never been effective with him anyway. The invitation, if it could be called that, was simple. A quiet gesture, a nod toward the forest at dusk. No ceremony in the daylight, no audience. Whatever was about to happen was not meant to be watched. It was meant to be endured. The forest received them without comment. Trees stood close, indifferent witnesses. Firelight flickered low and practical, not dramatic. This was not a spectacle. Vikings rarely wasted energy on spectacle when intention would do. There were older figures present, though none claimed authority. They did not speak much. They did not teach. They did not reassure. They had learned long ago that reassurance encourages thinking, and thinking was precisely what this moment was designed to interrupt. The boy was not asked questions. He was not told what would happen. He was not warned. Instead, he was given objects. A heavy animal skin, rough, warm from prior use, still carrying the weight of something that had once moved on its own. It was placed over his shoulders without ceremony, not as clothing, but as pressure, a reminder, a suggestion. The fire crackled, not loudly, just enough to occupy the edges of awareness. No chants, no prayers, no declarations. This was not about belief, it was about transition. The instruction, if there was one, came without words. Stop thinking like a person. Human thought is careful. It weighs options. It anticipates outcomes. It hesitates. This boy had never been particularly good at those things, which made him an ideal candidate for what came next. The Rite did not ask him to become something new. It asked him to stop being something familiar. Time behaved strangely here. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. The skin itched, heat built. Muscles tightened and released without instruction. Breath deepened. The body began making decisions without consulting the mind. This was the goal, not madness, not frenzy, reduction. Strip away planning, strip away language, strip away identity until only reaction remained. The elders watched carefully, not to guide, but to observe. There was no correction, no praise, only monitoring, the way one monitors a fire, not to control it, but to ensure it does not wander where it shouldn't. The boy's movements changed first. They grew broader, less precise, more committed. He no longer adjusted mid-motion. He followed through on everything, as if stopping halfway had been removed from his internal options. Sound followed. Not speech, not even shouting in the usual sense. Just raw output, breath forced outward, noise as release, noise as balance. Silence, it turned out, required too much restraint. This was not taught, it emerged. There is a common misconception that berserkers were trained through rigid discipline. The opposite was closer to the truth. What occurred here was not instruction, but permission. Permission to let go. Permission to stop managing oneself. Permission to exist as momentum. The skin was not a costume. It was a reminder. Heavy enough to pull posture forward, restrictive enough to limit finesse. It discouraged subtlety and rewarded force. Over time, the boy stopped noticing it consciously, which meant it was working. The firelight danced across shapes that no longer felt entirely human, though no transformation occurred in any literal sense. Nothing supernatural, nothing mystical. Just a body pushed into a state where instinct did the work thinking usually claimed. And something settled. Not calm, clarity. The unsettling part was how natural it felt. This was not a struggle, it was alignment. For the first time, his inner state matched his outer behavior. No resistance, no correction, no one telling him to slow down, be careful, think first. He was not becoming a warrior. Warriors required strategy. He was becoming a phenomenon. Something deployed rather than directed. Something unleashed rather than commanded. The village did not expect obedience from him. They expected impact. And that expectation shaped everything. When the rite ended quietly, without conclusion, nothing was announced. No one declared success. The elders simply stepped back, satisfied not because something dramatic had occurred, but because nothing had gone wrong, which for them was enough. The boy emerged from the forest altered, though not visibly changed. There was no mark, no symbol, no title bestowed. Identity formed later in hindsight. What had changed was internal. The boundary between thought and action had thinned. Where hesitation once flickered briefly, now it vanished entirely. He did not reflect on experiences. He absorbed them. This was not enlightenment. It was efficiency. The village understood instinctively what they now had. Not a protector, not a soldier, certainly not a leader. They had created, or rather uncovered, something that functioned best when released under specific conditions. Loud, direct, short-lived, intense. A force, not a person. This understanding came with rules, though none were written. Do not overuse, do not confine too long, do not expect subtlety. And most importantly, never ask him to explain himself. Explanation would pull him back into thought. Thought would fracture the state. The phenomenon worked only when it remained uninterested in understanding itself. There was mild irony in this, of course. A society built on stories, lineage, and memory had created something that existed best without narrative. He did not tell stories about himself. Others would do that later, often badly. For now, he simply existed, wrapped in skin, fueled by momentum, defined not by skill, but by surrender. And though the word Berserker had not yet been spoken, its shape was already present, not as a title, but as a function, not a warrior, an event. Trance and mushrooms. At this stage, the stories begin to disagree with one another, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make historians sigh and reach for qualifiers, like possibly, perhaps, and the evidence suggests. This is where certainty thins and interpretation takes over. Some accounts speak of substances, others remain silent. A few hint at altered states without naming their cause. The truth, inconveniently, sits somewhere in between uncomfortable, incomplete, and perfectly suited to speculation. What matters more than the substance itself is the state it describes. The berserk state was not a mood. It was not emotion. It was not even aggression in the usual sense. It was a narrowing of perception so complete that the outside world became background noise. Pain, fear, time, these things did not disappear. They simply stopped demanding attention. If certain plants or fungi played a role, they were not treated as tools to be understood. No instructions survive, no recipes, no dosage. This was not chemistry. It was ritualized uncertainty. The goal was never intoxication. The goal was separation. Separation from ordinary awareness, from linear time, from the constant internal commentary that tells most people what something means before it happens. In this state, sensation arrived unfiltered. Heat was just heat. Sound was just vibration. Pressure was just force. Meaning arrived later, if at all. Observers struggled to describe it. They reached for metaphors instead. Like a storm, like a beast, like something not fully here. None of these were explanations. They were admissions of failure. Time behaved poorly around him. Moments stretched or collapsed without warning. What felt brief to witnesses felt endless to him, or the reverse. This distortion was not dramatic. It was subtle and deeply disorienting. Actions followed actions without pause, without reflection, without the internal clock most people rely on to pace themselves. This is where the unsettling reputation began to solidify. Because when pain no longer organizes behavior, it stops functioning as a signal. It becomes data acknowledged but deprioritized. Not ignored, simply irrelevant. This was not invulnerability. It was indifference. And indifference is far more disturbing. The community noticed the effect long before enemies ever did. People began giving him space, not out of fear exactly, out of uncertainty. Conversations paused when he entered. Eye contact shortened. Tasks were reassigned quietly. This was not rejection, it was caution. He was no longer merely intense. He was unpredictable in a way that resisted empathy. You could not read his limits. You could not tell when something mattered to him or when it didn't. Reactions came late or not at all. Expressions failed to map cleanly onto internal states. This made him effective and uncomfortable. From a strategic standpoint, the value was obvious. The Berserk state radiated disruption. It unsettled opponents not through action alone, but through presence. The refusal to respond correctly to stimuli broke expectations. People rely on patterns. He erased them. Psychological impact requires no contact. It requires contradiction. Someone who does not respond to pressure as expected forces everyone around them to recalibrate in real time. That recalibration costs attention. Attention costs energy. Energy drains quickly when nothing behaves as it should. This was the true weapon. Not strength, not endurance, uncertainty. And yet the cost of this effectiveness was social distance. Allies began to step back, not dramatically, not openly, just enough. They learned to position themselves slightly farther away, to speak a little louder, to avoid standing directly behind him. It was not personal, it was logistical. You could not predict where his momentum would carry him once the state took hold. He was not malicious. He was simply uninterested in coordination while inside it. Collaboration required timing. Timing required awareness. Awareness had been intentionally reduced. This created a paradox. He was valuable precisely because he could not be fully integrated. The village which once struggled to contain him now struggled to place him. He was no longer a problem to manage day to day. He was a condition to deploy occasionally and recover from afterward. Recovery, interestingly, was quiet. After the state passed, there was no triumph, no reflection, no story told from his perspective. He did not recount experiences. He did not analyze outcomes. He simply returned, emptied of commentary, as if whatever had occurred belonged to someone else. This reinforced the growing sense that there were now two versions of him, neither entirely separate, neither fully present at the same time. One existed within the community, functional, difficult, manageable. The other emerged under specific conditions, then vanished again, leaving behind disrupted space and unsettled observers. The light irony here was hard to ignore. The same society that prized cohesion had created something that functioned best in isolation. The same people who valued shared experience now relied on someone whose defining trait was disconnection. No one celebrated this contradiction. They tolerated it. They learned to work around it, and over time the stories exaggerated the edges. Mushrooms became certainty. Trance became madness. Indifference became immunity. History prefers clean lines. Reality, unfortunately, does not cooperate. What remains consistent across accounts is not the substance, but the surrender. The berserk state was not achieved through effort. It arrived when effort stopped, when self-monitoring dropped away entirely. Whether aided by plants, rituals, exhaustion, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. A narrowing, a quieting, a body moving faster than thought. By now, the transformation was complete. He was no longer simply a person with excess energy. He was an experience others had around him. And experiences, unlike people, are remembered for how they make others feel, not for what they intended. By the end of this phase, allies no longer tried to understand him. They adjusted their distance, they adjusted their expectations, and they accepted a simple truth that had been forming since childhood. Whatever he was now, he was not meant to be close. He was meant to be released. First battles. When the moment finally arrived, it did not look like heroism. There was no ceremony, no dramatic preparation, no speech about courage or destiny. The village had learned by now not to frame events around him in traditional ways. He did not respond to meaning. He responded to conditions. And the conditions had shifted. This was the first time his state would be introduced into something real, not controlled labor, not managed exertion, but open conflict, where nothing waited patiently to be directed. Observers noticed the first odd choice immediately. He did not wear armor. This was not bravery. Vikings respected armor. They valued protection. This was not a rejection of safety for symbolic reasons. It was simpler than that. Armor interfered. It slowed movement. It dulled sensation. It imposed rules on a body that already rejected them. For someone who relied on momentum and immediacy, armor was not a shield. It was an argument, and arguments required thinking. So he left it behind. This decision unsettled everyone. Armor was predictable. Armor made sense. A person without it disrupted expectation before anything else happened. Even allies found themselves glancing over, unsure whether to intervene or step aside. They chose the second option. From a distance, his presence did not resemble a trained fighter. There were no refined stances, no rehearsed movements. He did not position himself carefully. He did not wait for signals. He did not synchronize. Instead, he announced himself. Not verbally, not exactly. The sound came first, not speech, not a command, but raw output, breath forced outward, noise that carried intent without language. It was not a battle cry in the heroic sense. It was closer to a system venting pressure. This alone had an effect. People expect patterns in conflict. They expect formations, pauses, recognizable signals. He offered none. His movement did not escalate gradually. It began already in excess, and excess is difficult to process. Those facing him reacted before understanding why. Attention scattered, focus broke, coordination hesitated. This hesitation mattered more than any physical contact ever could. The disruption had already done its work. He did not fight with strategy. He fought against expectation. Every movement contradicted what observers believed should happen next. There was no rhythm to anticipate, no safe distance to calculate, no predictable reaction to pressure. This unpredictability spread outward. People began responding not to him, but to the fear of misreading him. That fear slowed them, made them cautious, pulled them inward, and by the time they realized what was happening, the psychological balance had already shifted. Allies watched from the edges. They needed him. That much was clear. The effect was undeniable. The opposing side had begun to fragment not from force, but from confusion. Order dissolved quietly, without anyone issuing a command to abandon it. But the allies did not move closer. They widened the space around him. This was instinctive. You could not align yourself with something that did not pause, did not signal, did not acknowledge shared timing. He did not adjust to others. Others adjusted away from him. This created a strange formation, if it could be called that. A gap. A moving absence at the center of activity, defined not by where people stood, but by where they chose not to. The irony was subtle, but persistent. He was most effective alone, yet never truly solitary, always surrounded by distance, always encircled by caution. From the outside, the scene looked chaotic. From inside it, it felt inevitable. The sound continued. The motion did not slow. Time compressed. To witnesses, everything seemed to happen at once. To him, it unfolded without sequence, just action following action, unbroken by thought. When it ended, and it did end, eventually it ended quietly. No victory cry, no celebration, no recounting of moments. He did not appear triumphant. He appeared emptied, as if the event had passed through him rather than been experienced by him. This, too, unsettled people. They were accustomed to aftermath, to reflection, to emotion arriving late. He offered none of that. Instead, he stepped away. Not ceremonially, not with acknowledgement. He simply exited the space where attention had gathered, leaving behind an absence that felt louder than his arrival. The stories began almost immediately, not because he told them, because others needed to. They spoke about the lack of armor, the sound, the way people seemed to falter before anything tangible occurred, the way proximity felt dangerous even for allies. Each retelling sharpened the edges. Soon the details mattered less than the impression. He became less a participant and more a rumor. This was how reputation moved faster than ships. Not carried deliberately, but propelled by discomfort, by the need to warn others, by the impulse to explain why something had felt wrong before it felt threatening. He doesn't move like us. He doesn't stop when you expect. Don't stand too close. These were not insults. They were instructions. Within a short time, his presence alone began to do work. People reacted earlier, prepared differently, lost confidence sooner. The psychological effect preceded any physical engagement. And yet, among allies, the distance remained. They required him, but did not trust proximity. They respected the effect, but did not seek connection. He was not invited into shared planning. He was assigned a direction and left to it. This suited him. Coordination would have slowed him. Discussion would have diluted the state. He functioned best when not consulted, which left the community in an uncomfortable position. They had gained something powerful. They had also lost something familiar. He was no longer fully part of them. Not because he was rejected, but because his usefulness required separation. He existed at the boundary, between intention and outcome, between order and disruption. And that boundary became his identity. By the end of these first real encounters, the transformation was complete. He was no longer a child with excess energy. He was no longer a managed project. He was no longer even a phenomenon confined to the village. He was a reputation in motion, and reputations, once released, cannot be recalled. Friendly fire and reputation. The problem with forces that cannot distinguish is not their strength. It is their honesty. By this point, everyone involved understood a quiet truth. The Berserker did not recognize sides in the way others did. Not because he was confused, because distinction required a level of awareness that no longer existed once the state took hold. This realization arrived slowly. At first, allies blamed chance. Wrong place, bad timing, miscommunication. These explanations were comforting because they implied solvable errors. Adjust the plan, clarify the signal, improve coordination. But none of that worked. The issue was not logistics. It was proximity. When the Berserker entered his state, everything near him became part of the same problem, moving objects in space, exerting pressure, demanding response. The difference between friend and foe was a social construct. The state had no use for it. This made him dangerous to everyone. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply by design. Allies learned this the way people usually learn uncomfortable truths, by surviving them, by stepping back at the right moment, by noticing patterns that did not care about loyalty. The solution was not to control him. That had already failed. The solution was to avoid him. This marked a turning point not in his behavior, but in everyone else's. Entire strategies began to form around absence, where he would move, where he would not, when to advance, when to pause, when to let the space around him expand naturally. The most important lesson was simple. Never stand where he might pass through. This was not cowardice, it was adaptation. Veteran fighters adjusted their instincts. Newcomers were warned quietly, not with dramatic speeches, but with practical advice. Stay wide. Give him room. If he's near, step back. These were survival tips, not criticisms. Over time, these adjustments became formalized, though no one would have called them tactics. They were habits, reflexes, unspoken agreements shared through glances and spacing. An invisible geometry formed around him. He moved. Others orbited. This geometry worked surprisingly well. By allowing the Berserker space, allies preserved both effectiveness and safety. The disruption he caused spread outward without consuming those who knew how to position themselves. The cost was distance, emotional and physical. No one joked with him during these moments. No one sought eye contact. He was not included in coordination. He was acknowledged only as motion. This created an uncomfortable duality. He was indispensable. He was also unapproachable. The mild irony was hard to ignore. The same presence that destabilized opponents forced allies into discipline of their own. They became more aware, more cautious, more precise, if only to avoid being caught in the wake. In this way, he improved the group without ever intending to. The myth began here, not from exaggeration, but from selective memory. Stories traveled faster than accuracy ever could. They focused on the moments of chaos, the near misses, the sudden retreats. They ignored the careful spacing, the practiced avoidance, the unglamorous survival tactics that actually made everything function. People do not like telling stories about distance. They prefer stories about impact. So the Berserker became larger in retelling, more uncontrollable, more singular, a figure who could not be reasoned with, not even by those on his own side. This was not entirely false. It was incomplete. The truth was quieter. He was predictable in one very specific way. He always behaved the same once the state took over. It was everyone else who had to change. But predictability does not sound impressive. Danger does. And so the reputation grew. Soon, his name, if it was ever spoken, mattered less than the idea attached to it. He became shorthand for chaos that did not ask permission, for disruption that could not be negotiated with, for an outcome that arrived without warning. This reputation did work long before he did. Opponents hesitated earlier. Allies adjusted sooner. Entire encounters shifted based on the possibility of his presence, whether he appeared or not. He had become a psychological event. The unsettling part was how detached he was from all of this. He did not cultivate the myth. He did not correct it. He did not even seem aware of it. When the state passed, he returned, as he always had, quiet, distant, uninterested in narrative. Others filled the silence for him. They debated whether he understood what he did, whether he remembered it, whether he cared. These questions had no answers, and so they became fuel for legend. Distance made imagination easier, Eventually, the story stopped matching the person entirely. He became something else in the telling, something larger, less human, more useful as an idea than as a man. And this suited the community in a strange way. It allowed them to externalize discomfort, to place chaos somewhere outside themselves, to believe that disorder came from a source rather than emerging naturally from circumstance. The Berserker became that source. In reality, he was simply the most visible expression of something the society already contained, the acceptance that not all force can be refined and not all tools can be safely held. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. No one stood beside him anymore. Not because they rejected him, because they had learned better. They stood around him, ahead of him, far from him. They learned to survive in his presence, not by trusting him, but by respecting what he represented. And as the myth grew louder, the truth grew quieter. That truth was simple, unsettling, and easily forgotten. He was never out of control. He was operating exactly as intended. It was the world around him that had to bend. Love, aging, and slowing down. Storms do not stop all at once. They lose intensity first, then frequency, then relevance. For someone like him, slowing down did not arrive as a decision. There was no moment of reflection, no sudden desire for peace. The change came the way it usually does, with time insisting quietly and repeatedly until resistance became inefficient. Love played a role here, though not the kind people prefer to describe. This was not romance as poetry. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden softness. Love arrived as something sturdier, something heavier, a presence that did not ask him to become different, only to stay. It functioned like an anchor, not pulling him backward, but preventing endless drift. Someone waited. Someone expected him to return. Someone noticed patterns long before he did. Meals appeared on time. Tools were placed where he would find them. Words were few, but consistent. This mattered more than affection ever could. For the first time, his absence created inconvenience for someone other than himself. That inconvenience was tolerated but noticed. And slowly, this awareness introduced friction, not enough to stop him, but enough to shorten the distance. Aging assisted. It always does. Strength remained, but recovery took longer. The body still responded, but less eagerly. Momentum required encouragement. The berserk state did not vanish. It simply demanded a higher price to enter. He did not mourn this. He did not analyze it. He adjusted. This adjustment was subtle. He arrived later. He stayed back. He moved closer to the edge rather than the center. Others noticed before he did. They began placing him differently, consulting him without expecting participation. This shift was not announced. It was negotiated through habit. The community no longer needed him where chaos was immediate. They needed him where memory carried weight, where reputation could do the work that movement once did. He transitioned, almost accidentally, from presence to symbol. Young fighters watched him with a mix of fascination and caution. They asked questions he did not answer directly. Instead, he told stories, unreliable ones, exaggerated ones, stories where the details wandered and the emphasis shifted. This was not deception. It was distance. He had never been good at precision in language. Now, with time smoothing edges, the stories grew larger than accuracy required. He leaned into this without fully intending to. Embellishment filled the gaps where explanation would have failed. Ironically, this made the stories more useful. Accuracy teaches, myth motivates, He trained without training. There were no drills, no formal lessons, just presence, just observation, just the occasional interruption, "Don't stand there," or "Leave space." Advice shaped by survival rather than theory. Young listeners tried to imitate what they understood, which was usually the wrong part. They copied volume. They copied posture. They copied attitude. He watched this with mild amusement. He knew better than to correct them too much. Some lessons required disappointment. As his roles shifted, so did the way others treated him. Distance remained, but the fear softened. He was no longer an immediate hazard. He was a reference point, a reminder of what excess looked like when fully expressed. This created a strange affection, not closeness, not warmth, respect with boundaries. He accepted this easily. It required no effort. Being central had never suited him anyway. Observing from the side felt natural, efficient. The irony was not lost on those who noticed. The person once defined by unstoppable motion had become a fixed point. The storm, now charted rather than endured. Love, if it could still be called, that settled into routine. Not passion, but persistence. Shared silence, predictable evenings, the absence of questions. This steadiness did not change who he was. It reduced how often the extremes appeared. And that was enough. The Berserker, as an idea, continued to grow even as the man receded. Stories traveled farther now, untethered from first-hand experience. They grew louder, sharper, more theatrical. People preferred the version that did not age. He allowed this. Correcting myths required energy. Energy was better spent elsewhere. Occasionally, someone would ask if the stories were true. He would shrug, or smile slightly, or change the subject. Truth, after all, had never been the point. By this stage, he understood something the younger version never could. Impact does not require presence. Reputation moves on its own. The community benefited from this. His name or what it represented still shaped decisions, still altered behavior, still discouraged recklessness, all without requiring his participation. This suited everyone. He grew quieter. Not gentler, just quieter. The intensity condensed rather than disappeared. It lived in posture, in gaze, in the way he chose when to speak. When he did speak, people listened. Not because he commanded attention, because silence had learned to gather around him. And in that quiet, something unexpected emerged. Not peace, resolution. The storm had not ended. It had learned where to stop. And for someone who had never been designed for stillness, that was not a loss. It was mastery of a different kind. Death without battle. The ending, when it arrived, disappointed almost everyone. Not him, everyone else. After decades of noise of presence that bent space and attention, people expected symmetry. A final moment that matched the scale of the reputation. Something loud. Something decisive. Something that could be told in one sentence without qualifiers. That is not what happened. There was no battlefield, no surge of momentum, no audience gathered at a careful distance. There was no last release of energy, no dramatic contrast between silence and impact. The end came quietly, the way most real endings do. He did not fall in motion. He did not collapse into legend. He did not even provide a clear timeline. He simply stopped being present in the way people had grown used to. The storm did not explode. It dissipated. This was inconvenient for storytelling. Communities prefer conclusions, that explain everything that came before them. They want the ending to justify the cost, to confirm that the noise meant something specific. A heroic death would have done that. A final stand, a last appearance, a clean transition from man to myth. Instead, there was an absence. He stayed home more, spoke less, traveled shorter distances. The pauses between activity grew longer, until activity itself became the interruption rather than the norm. People noticed, but they did not know what to do with the information. He had never announced transitions. He had never invited commentary. Now even decline happened without consultation. There was mild irony here. The man who once disrupted entire formations now disrupted expectations simply by remaining still. His quiet, unsettled people more than his noise ever had. Silence invited questions. Questions required answers. Answers were not forthcoming. And then one day, he did not return. Not from battle, from routine. The space he usually occupied remained empty. Tools stayed where they had been placed. Food cooled untouched. The absence lingered long enough to become undeniable. There was no ceremony. No one rushed to name the moment. Because what would they say? That the Berserker, whose identity had been built on excess, had exited the world without spectacle? That the force which once terrified both allies and opponents had simply concluded? It felt incorrect, unfair, almost rude. So people waited, as if waiting might restore the balance. It did not. His passing did not rearrange the world immediately. There was no visible rupture, no collective intake of breath. The community continued, work was done, evenings arrived on schedule. This too felt wrong. Legends are supposed to leave marks, but real people often leave gaps instead. Only later did the conversations begin. Quiet ones at first, then more confident. Stories resurfaced not to honor the ending, but to replace it. The mind resists anticlimax. It seeks shape where none is offered. So the stories adjusted. He became louder in memory than he had ever been in life. Details sharpened, timelines tightened, contradictions smoothed themselves out. The quiet ending was pushed aside, politely ignored. This was not deception. It was maintenance. Myths require structure. A gentle ending destabilizes them. So the community performed a kind of narrative correction, not consciously, not maliciously, but efficiently. He would have wanted it that way, someone said, which was unprovable and therefore useful. Others insisted he had chosen the quiet, that it was intentional, that withdrawing without drama was the final act of control. These explanations comforted people who needed intention behind everything. The truth was simpler. He had never cared how stories ended. The irony was complete. The man who had lived as an event did not die as one. And yet, the myth that followed required drama. So drama was supplied retroactively, borrowed from earlier moments and rearranged into a more satisfying conclusion. The Berserker, as an idea, benefited greatly from this. The human being did not. But the human being was no longer available to object. In the years that followed, the stories spread wider. They crossed water. They picked up accents and emphasis. They lost context and gained certainty. The quiet ending vanished entirely. In some versions, he returned to battle one last time. In others, he chose isolation, disappearing into the forest. Some claimed he could not be contained by age. Others insisted he burned out spectacularly. All of these versions had something in common. They were louder than the truth. The community, which had once lived alongside him, noticed this shift with mixed feelings. They recognized the inaccuracies, but they also recognized the usefulness. The myth did work the man no longer could. It warned. It intimidated. It instructed poorly but enthusiastically. Young people listened. They asked questions. They tried to replicate the surface features without understanding the cost. The elders corrected gently or not at all. Some lessons were no longer worth refining. Distance increased with each retelling. The Berserker became a symbol not of chaos, but of permission, the permission to imagine oneself as unstoppable, even briefly. This was appealing. It always is. No one talked about the slowing down. No one mentioned the waiting. No one lingered on the quiet. Those parts complicated the story, and complication weakens legend. What remained was an outline: noise, disruption, fear, impact. A simplified sequence that could be taught, exaggerated, and safely misunderstood. The real ending, uneventful, unheroic, unresolved, was set aside like an inconvenient footnote. Yet there was something fitting about it. The person who had never aligned comfortably with expectation did not align with it at the end either. He did not provide closure. He did not complete an arc. He simply stopped. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to finish the story for him. This is how myths begin, not with grand finales, but with gaps that refuse to stay empty. When explanation fails, imagination steps in. When silence persists, narrative fills the space. The Berserker did not become a legend by how he lived. He became one because of how he ended by refusing to perform one last time. The storm did not roar itself out. It faded, and in that fading, something larger took its place. Not a man, not a memory, a story louder, simpler, and far less accurate than the life it replaced. Legacy of chaos? Long after the man disappeared, the noise stayed. Not the real noise, the breath, the movement, the physical disruption, but the echo, the kind that lingers after a storm, has already passed and convinces people it might return at any moment. This is how legacies usually work. They are not built by accuracy. They are built by repetition. Children were the first to inherit it. They did not know the man. They knew the outline, the posture, the volume. They played games that involved shouting suddenly, charging without warning, pretending not to feel imaginary pain. Someone always volunteered to be the berserker. Someone else always stepped back. The rules were vague. The excitement was not. Adults watched from a distance, half amused, half concerned. They corrected the dangerous parts. They ignored the rest. The games were loud, chaotic, short-lived, just like the stories. No one explained where the image came from. It was already there. Songs followed, not careful ones, not historical ones. Songs that exaggerated because exaggeration was easier than nuance. Verses stretched events into spectacles. Choruses repeated the same lines until repetition replaced meaning. Armor was removed entirely in the telling. Fear became contagious. Control vanished completely. The Berserker became unstoppable not because anyone remembered him that way, but because unstoppable characters are easier to remember. The irony, of course, was that none of this resembled the person very closely, but resemblance was no longer required. The Berserker had crossed the final threshold from human experience into symbol. Once that happens, accuracy becomes optional. He was no longer discussed as someone who had lived alongside others. He was discussed as something that happened to them, a force, a disruption, a cautionary figure whose presence explained outcomes without requiring deeper analysis. This was useful. Societies like symbols. They simplify conversations, they shorten explanations, they allow complex realities to be referenced quickly. Don't do that, someone might say. You'll end up like him. The phrase required no clarification. It didn't matter what like him meant anymore. What mattered was that everyone understood the warning. Over time, the symbol drifted further away from its origin, the quieter truths aging, slowing down, the unremarkable ending were shed. They complicated the message, they softened the edges, and legends prefer sharp edges. What remained was chaos, framed as strength, noise, framed as power, unpredictability, framed as freedom. This was not entirely wrong, it was simply incomplete. The man himself had never sought freedom in the abstract. He had sought relief from restraint, from correction, from constant adjustment to expectations that never fit. Chaos had not been a philosophy, it had been a byproduct. But philosophy was added later. In this later version, the Berserker became a kind of permission slip, proof that one could reject restraint and still matter, that one could disrupt systems rather than serve them and still leave a mark. This was comforting to some, dangerous to others. Most people misunderstood which parts were survivable. The community, watching all this unfold over generations, developed a quiet distance from the myth. They did not challenge it openly. They simply stopped correcting it. Truth, after all, requires energy. And energy had learned to be spent selectively. They knew something the stories did not emphasize. The Berserker had never built anything alone. He had existed within a system that learned how to absorb him, redirect him, survive him. The chaos only became legacy because structure held long enough to carry it forward. This distinction was rarely mentioned. It did not make for good songs. And yet, this unspoken balance between order and disruption was the real inheritance. The society had not been shaped only by its planners, its navigators, its careful thinkers. It had also been shaped by those who could not be contained easily, those who forced adaptation not through ideas but through pressure. Progress does not come only from wisdom. Sometimes it comes from friction. The Berserker represented that friction, exaggerated and simplified but still recognizable. He became a reminder that systems are not tested by those who fit comfortably within them. They are tested by those who don't. This realization lingered quietly beneath the noise of legend. Children grew up, games faded, songs changed, the symbol remained. It shifted forms, adapted to new contexts, attached itself to new anxieties, but its core stayed the same. A reminder that control is never complete, that unpredictability cannot be eliminated, only managed, that societies are shaped not just by calm hands and careful minds, but by forces that refuse refinement. The late irony was gentle. The Berserker, once feared for his inability to integrate, became a shared cultural reference, something understood by everyone, a common language for excess. He belonged more fully in memory than he ever had in life. And perhaps that was inevitable. Real people are inconvenient. Symbols are efficient. As the night settles and the story draws to a close, what remains is not instruction, not warning, not celebration, just acknowledgement. That civilization is not built only by those who think before they act. It is also shaped by those who act before thinking is possible, those who strain systems until they reveal their limits, those who force adaptation simply by existing. The Berserker was never meant to be admired. He was meant to be survived. And in surviving him, the society learned something it would never write down but never forget. Chaos does not destroy order by default. Sometimes it teaches order where it was weakest. And that, quietly, is its legacy.